If I called someone a sophist, what would you think of them? I doubt it would be a very flattering picture. The term sophist is an insult in our lexicon and has been for thousands of years. To quote the Cambridge English Dictionary, a sophist is a person who uses sophistry, i.e., clever but untrue arguments, in order to deceive people. We might call a particularly deceptive politician a sophist, or someone who appears to be persuasive, but on closer inspection is indulging in numerous logical fallacies and poor argumentation to get their point across. The term has thus come to be associated with empty rhetoric, and the sophist himself is seen as a dastardly and self-interested figure. Sophistry is viewed as antithetical to philosophy proper, which is the love of wisdom, and sophists give merely the false appearance of this. But the sophists were also real thinkers who lived in ancient Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. And I think the evidence for this view of their work isn't nearly as convincing as it's often assumed to be. So this video is, in short, a defense of the sophists, and an attempt to look at their work a little bit more positively. Before we get started, I should say that because this is ancient philosophy, the question of how to interpret the sophists is hotly debated. Additionally, I wanted to give a shout out to the Cambridge Companion to the Sophists because it was such a helpful secondary source for this video, and I'll be referencing it a lot throughout. But first, what are the charges laid at the sophists' feet? My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. The Villainous Sophists. Surprisingly, the pejorative sense of the word sophist isn't new at all. Whereas our modern ideas of words like stoic or cynic or skeptic have drifted quite far from their usage in ancient Greece and ancient philosophy, this insulting sense of the word sophist stretches at least as far back as Plato, and probably even before then. According to the classic story, which is often an oversimplified version of Plato's account mixed in with a few disparaging comments from later authors, including Aristotle, the Sophists were a group of teachers and thinkers in the 5th and early 4th century BC. While Socrates was out there in Athens trying to seek genuine wisdom and expand people's minds, the Sophists were his erstwhile antagonists. They were people wandering about, proclaiming that they held real philosophical wisdom, but not only were their arguments spurious, they were often outright teaching immorality and intellectual vice to the youth. They were something like philosophical conmen who claimed to be able to impart wisdom and virtue, but in the end sold only counterfeit goods. The most famous example of the foolishness of the Sophists on full display is in Plato's dialogue Euthydemus, where Socrates meets with two sophists, who proceed to give him some of the worst arguments in Plato's entire works. The two sophists in the dialogue, Euthydemus and Dionysodorus, appear on the surface to be learned and clever men, and could produce very interesting sounding arguments. But those arguments also fall apart rather quickly upon Socrates' questioning. Euthydemus and Dionysodorus also argue in extreme bad faith. Unlike Socrates, who is conducting the dialogue in the spirit of free and open inquiry, genuinely hoping to get to the truth of the matter, these two sophists are largely concerned with just showing off as much as they can and not appearing in the public eye to have lost the debate. They are presented a little bit like ancient Athenian debate bros, who abuse philosophical argumentation in the name of looking smart and conning people into paying their fees. This picture of the sophists as image-obsessed also appears in Plato's Protagoras, which is otherwise relatively amicable to the sophists. There, he talks about the sophists indulging their adoring fans, and he presents them a little bit like pampered ivory tower intellectuals. Not necessarily stupid, but misguided, and a poor counterpart to Socrates' more austere approach to philosophy. Although there is a more sympathetic portrayal of the most influential sophist of all, Protagoras himself, than there was of Euthydemus and Dionysodorus, there is still a lot of poking fun at the peculiarities of the sophist manner of conducting themselves, which is presented in a negative and slightly self-seeking way. Another accusation that's often leveled at the sophists is that they claimed like they can make people better, but in fact they taught immorality and outright vice. Take the sophist Thrasymachus at the beginning of Plato's Republic, who argues that might makes right, and whatever is good for the more powerful person just is justice. This portrayal is in keeping with the idea that the sophists were just unconcerned with what was really right or wrong, and far more concerned with personal power and how to get it. both in the sense that they would serve the elite of Athens, who were the only ones who could afford their admittedly quite extortionate tuition fees, but also in the sense that they themselves pursued personal glory with no regard for truth or for ethical principle. This is where we see the image of the sophist as unscrupulous, self-serving, and amoral. It's also evident in the common accusation that the sophists taught people how to argue for any side of the debate, regardless of what side was true or untrue, or right or wrong. The idea is that they had a kind of flagrant disregard for both morality and truth. And finally, the sophists were often presented as extreme relativists about things like truth and ethics, arguing that there was no real truth, but only different people's opinions on things, and that there was no right or wrong, but just what various people thought about matters. The evidence for this is normally something like Protagoras' saying that man is the measure of all things, which, in this, I would say, uncharitable interpretation, is interpreted as saying that each individual man is the measure of what is true for that particular person, and thus everyone has their own private subjective truth that they can appeal to. When we mesh this with their fondness for debate and rhetoric, the sophist is painted as a kind of post-truth schemer, disbelieving in actual truth or actual knowledge, and simply thinking that whoever can convince the most people is ipso facto correct. Through a game of historical telephone, this is the view of the sophist that has arrived with us today, and thus their name remains an insult literally 2 millennia after their death. Now, as it turns out, this classic picture of the sophists isn't even particularly faithful to Plato's account in the details, but it is the one that has endured in the public imagination. It's not unusual to see even incredibly well-read and philosophically informed people repeat this kind of received story of who the sophists were and what they did. And so the rest of this video is going to be challenging this received perception and arguing that the evidence points towards many sophists being sophisticated and delicate thinkers. And in some cases, the sophists were even far ahead of the curve, anticipating approaches to philosophical problems that would not re-enter the mainstream for quite literally centuries, and are now considered fruitful areas for research. So, I'm going to defend the sophists from each of these accusations in turn, and try to persuade you that they are very much worth reading. And let's start with the most notorious one of all. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. 2. Arguments leading nowhere. Okay, first we have to do a bit of, historical housekeeping. We often talk about ancient Greek and Roman philosophy in terms of movements or schools, like the Platonists, the Peripatetics, the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Cynics, and so on and so forth. So it's tempting to hear the term sophist and think that this must be sort of used in a similar way. But in fact, the sophists weren't really recognized as related to one another pretty much at all until after most of their deaths. If you were to ask Protagoras whether he was part of a well-defined intellectual movement with other notable sophists, he would have probably been a little bit confused. He appeared to know some of the other noteworthy sophists, but mostly because ancient Athens is a bit of a small world and the intellectual scene of ancient Athens is considerably smaller, rather than because they were part of the same intellectual movement and all identified as so. From an outside perspective, it seems that most people at the time just didn't see much of a difference between the figures we now call the sophists, other ancient thinkers and scholars of all kinds, and indeed Socrates himself. In a play called The Clouds, the comic playwright Aristophanes, who was contemporaneous with both the sophists and Socrates, treats all the intellectuals of Athens as kind of one big group and makes fun of them as a collective. He lumps Socrates in with the sophists. The word itself, sophist, was originally used just to refer to general intellectuals, whatever tradition they happen to come from and what they happen to believe. And it's only in the 4th century BC that we begin to see it used to refer to a particular set of thinkers. Thus, when I defend the sophists in this video, it's with the caveat that they are not a well-defined philosophical school. They are instead a loose collection of thinkers, teachers, and speechmakers who agreed on some things and maybe shared a general-ish direction and disagreed on many, many other things. As I said, the classic charge against the Sophists is that they argued for reputation or money or prestige or ego rather than to find truth, and moreover, that the quality of the arguments they put forward was pretty poor. Firstly, obviously, this is going to be true for some ancient Athenian intellectuals. You'd be able to find such people in every era among those who espouse any number of beliefs. The characters of Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus, if they actually lived and weren't just made up for Plato's dialogue, were very poor arguers, and they did seem uninterested in getting to the truth, and far more interested in seeming to win the argument and looking very clever. However, there is also some wider validity to this claim when it comes to the more reputable sophists. Two sophists who are generally seen as among the most important and the cleverest are Protagoras and Gorgias, and both of them both practiced and trained other people in the art of public speaking and public persuasion, what we'd now call rhetoric. However, it's really important to bear in mind the context in which they were working. In ancient Athens, any male citizen over the age of 30 was part of the assembly, and if they believed that a particular policy was good for the city-state, they would have to persuade the other members to vote for their proposal. Thus, while we might think of public speech-making as like a really, really niche skill, in Athens, it was essential if you wanted to be involved in public life, and especially if you wanted to be politically active or a political leader. Moreover, as Socrates himself found out, you could be hauled in front of the assembly yourself if you were accused of a crime, and in that case, you would be expected to defend yourself by giving a speech. Thus, speech-making just was a pretty important thing to learn. The idea that merely teaching people the art of being publicly persuasive is necessarily underhanded is ridiculous in this context. It comes from projecting our own cultural and societal milieu back onto the ancient Athenians, when we just live in very different situations. Additionally, the Sophists were writing before the classic separation that emerged between logic and rhetoric, because that arguably took place with Aristotle. So today, we think of good argumentation and persuasive argumentation as two entirely different things. The Sophists weren't blind to this distinction, and there are passages where Protagoras, for example, criticizes the arguments of others for being superficially persuasive but ultimately flawed. However, there's not the same neat, identifiable divide that we have today. Thus, when people like Protagoras and Gorgias teach argumentation and how to persuade an assembly, that doesn't mean that they were training people to ignore the quality of argumentation in favor of meaningless emotional appeals with no cognitive weight. Instead, it's more likely that they saw being persuasive and having good arguments as incredibly closely related, if not just hanging together. It's worth noting that the Sophists invented and pioneered what would later become simply logical argument techniques. For example, Gorgias was known for listing every possibility in his speeches and showing how, whatever possibility actually obtained, his conclusion followed. And we still use this argument structure today. It's called a proof by exhaustion, and it remains a perfectly valid way of arguing. It's used in mathematics all the time, and indeed in logic. Likewise, Protagoras did get his students to argue both sides of an issue, and some have seen this as disreputable or reflective of a lack of care for the truth. This was indeed part of his argumentative education, but I don't think there is any reason to infer from this that Protagoras actually thought that no side of the case could be the correct one, or that no arguments were better than any other arguments. Giving both sides of an issue is a standard philosophical exercise that is still assigned to undergraduate students today. Not only should you learn to give your own point across as best as possible, you should be familiar with lots of possible counter-arguments that could be raised against it. I remember being told at university that you should know so much about a position that you're opposing that if you were ever called to defend it, then you would be able to mount a strong and steel-manned argument for that viewpoint, even though you yourself don't believe in it and surely believe it has many flaws. Just because the Sophists were trying to be persuasive does not imply that they were not trying to be logically sound as well. They just wouldn't have been able to see it in those terms because of the time period they were writing in. We will come back on to some of the more Specific charges with Protagoras and not caring about truth later, but I wanted to address this point here. Mauro Bonazzi puts this rather wonderfully in his chapter on the topic. Speeches, logoi, are the sophist's speciality. At stake, however, was not only the practical issue of how to use the word successfully in public debates and private meetings. As George Kerferd, among others, has remarked, logos in Greek refers to speeches, words, and arguments, but also to mental processes, and it can even indicate structural principles and natural laws. The Sophists were working in a context where issues of logic, persuasiveness, and rhetoric had not yet been fully separated, and thus, when they talk about these topics together, that is not evidence of their duplicity, but merely their age. Moreover, logic is famously meant to be topic neutral, meaning that its structures are supposed to apply universally regardless of what subject matter you are working with. Because logic looks at the formal framework of argumentation rather than its content, you can identify an argument as structurally valid even if you disagree with literally every single premise that the argument involves. Take the following argument. 1. If the horizon looks flat to me, then the Earth is flat. 2. The horizon looks flat to me. 3. Therefore, the Earth is flat. This is a structurally valid argument, meaning that it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if all the premises leading up to it are true. Of course, the premises aren't all true, so we can't conclude the conclusion is true, but that's by the by. The point is that logic looks at the structure rather than the content. And if what Protagoras was teaching was the art of argumentation, which is a kind of precursor to logical inquiry, then we would expect that he would have the students study all manner of arguments, even in topics with which they're unfamiliar, and with conclusions that might even contradict one another, because the same structural observations would be worthwhile either way and would teach the students about argumentation as a whole. This, again, does not imply that Protagoras didn't care about truth. As the scholar Mi Kyung Lee puts it, when Protagoras says that for every argument there is an opposing argument, he is presumably pointing out that for every proposition there is an argon, struggle, between two opponents who take opposing sides on that position. Though the logical point may be obvious, that for every proposition P, one can negate it and get its contradictory, not P, it is far less obvious that one can always give arguments for both sides of any question. And with this framing, we can see that Protagoras' position does not imply a total disregard for the truth, but if anything, a kind of epistemic humility, and this is in keeping with a more general scholarly view of him as a moderate skeptic. It is more about recognizing the existence of arguments for alternative positions than saying that every argument is as good as any other. And again, we'll revisit some of these points in more detail later in the video. We can give a similar defense against the accusation, often repeated by his critics, that Protagoras and the other sophists taught people how to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger one, and that exact phrasing is often used. Because we don't have the exact context for this claim, it remains open to a wide range of interpretations. It could be that Protagoras taught that the weaker argument just in fact can sometimes persuade people more than the stronger one, and thus it's important not to neglect your rhetoric when you are learning to argue, lest this happen. This is actually quite similar to the point that Aristotle makes at the beginning of his own work on rhetoric, and no one would accuse him of actually desiring that the weaker argument defeats the stronger one, just pointing out that it sometimes can, as a empirical social fact. Moreover, as Joshua Billings argues, this judgment could have been made from the outside by someone who disagreed with the position Protagoras was giving. That is, Protagoras could have been arguing a position that others saw as weaker, but did so well and persuasively. This would not imply anything dastardly or dishonest. If an outside observer to Charles Darwin, say, saw him make the prima facie rather strange argument that humanity is descended from a common ancestor with the great apes, and saw him persuading others in the process, well, they might accuse him of making the weaker argument defeat the stronger. But all that would mean is that he was persuasively arguing for a position that the observer vehemently disagreed with. Billings also points out that this same charge was levelled at Socrates, indicating that it may have just been a wider suspicion about intellectuals in Athens at the time. All that being said, there is evidence that many sophists were also concerned with appearing cleverer than other people at a debate, just that it isn't their sole concern. In Plato's dialogue, Protagoras does at points drift into referencing the discussion underway as if it were a contest of wits. But there are two things that are quite worth saying here. The first is that just because someone might want to be well thought of does not itself imply that they are just a pretender who is uninterested in the soundness of their arguments. It's not unusual for someone to care about their reputation, and while we might think of it as a bit vain, it's quite a common vanity, and it's shared by many people who we wouldn't hesitate in calling true philosophers. But secondly, we must also be aware of the cultural context here. Athens in this period was famously an agonistic culture, where people were generally much more concerned about facing off against one another in various contests of excellence. It is likely that being the best public speaker or the best debater was a socially prized thing to be, separate from the quest to inquire into truth. To again quote Mi Kyung Lee, there were epideixes, live speaking performances, at festivals such as the Olympics and the Panathenaic Festival, which could involve performances of persuasive speeches, poetry, philosophy, and history, as well as multi-participant debates. We can think of this similar to how we think of modern debating competitions, where people are judged on the quality of their debating skills, separate from whether they are actually correct, since their positions have been randomly assigned to them. Of course, it doesn't follow from this that Protagoras or any other sophist did not also have genuine philosophical opinions of their own, which they sincerely believed in and tried to argue for. I'm not saying that positions were dealt out at random in these contests. I don't know. I don't think we have any evidence for that. But my point is that we should view this more akin to a sporting contest than a kind of intellectual pursuit as we would understand it today. And just because the sophists, and well, some of the sophists at least, were concerned with excellence in this sense, shouldn't imply that they didn't sincerely hold the beliefs that they espoused in philosophy, nor should it imply that they were unconcerned with the truth or with intellectual honesty. Additionally, we know that some sophists were engaged in making fine logical or technical distinctions that would likely have almost no persuasive or rhetorical power, but were almost certainly undertaken out of a wish to understand argument itself in a proto-logical way. Prodicus, who is often considered the third most significant Stoic after Protagoras and Gorgias, was reportedly very interested in finding the correct definitions of various words, and in Plato's dialogues, he is made fun of, but he's not made fun of for being a showman, he's made fun of for being really pedantic. Making these fine distinctions between word meanings is not a strong rhetorical strategy, but it is what we would expect if someone were trying to have a precise, good faith argument, or trying to understand argument itself as a field of study. Thus, even in Plato's dialogues, which are pretty biased against the sophists, we do have evidence for major sophist figures being interested in arguments in a way that's largely unrelated to persuasiveness or individual, dastardly, self-interested gain. Thus, although there were people who probably did seek the sophists out just to learn how to persuade people, regardless of the correctness of their view, this is not the position of many sophists themselves. There are exceptions to this, like Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus, but if we take the more well-known sophists, then the evidence seems to point in the other direction. That while they were interested in rhetoric and persuasion, they were also interested in the soundness of argumentation. The way they went about this looks quite different to how we would do it today, but that is no more surprising than the fact that the ancient Greek way of doing physics or chemistry or medicine also looks rather different from how we would do that today. So I think this is point one for the sophists. But what about the idea that the sophists were all great corrupters, teaching the youth of Athens all kinds of immorality? Well, it's actually quite an interesting and complex point, and I can't wait to talk about it. 3. Corrupting the youth. Famously, Socrates was charged with impiety and with corrupting the youth, and was eventually executed for this crime. Yet, he was not the only one who raised eyebrows in this way. In later centuries, the sophists were perceived to have led the rich young men of Athens who could afford their fees into immoral or amoral practices, encouraging them to scorn the traditional respect for the gods and instead to get whatever they want out of life, caution and morality and ethics to the wind. This paints the Sophists as both egoists and hedonists. But again, this is not quite where the evidence itself takes us. Firstly, like in the last section, I will acknowledge that there are some Sophists who do seem to behave like this. We have already seen the case of Thrasymachus, but there is also the sophist Antiphon, who in one passage advises his pupils to follow the laws and mores of society in public, but to privately follow their own nature, which in the context of the passage appears to mean indulging their own private egoistic desires. So, for Antiphon at least, there is a genuine opposition between public law and morality and nature, and he favors following the latter as a prescriptive piece of advice whenever you can get away with it. There are some that have questioned the interpretation of Antiphon here, but this does seem to remain the dominant reading of the text from what I could find. However, for the other Sophists, this idea of egoistic hedonism becomes much harder to sustain. For one thing, Protagoras explicitly argues that virtue is desirable and even that it can be taught to everyone, and this idea is echoed in a passage by the sophist Prodicus, where he argues, using a fable, that while the path of virtue is difficult, it is still ultimately worthwhile and better than the path of vice. In a passage in Xenophon's Dialogues, the sophist Hippias, who's another major figure in this non-movement, argues that there are God-given laws passed down to us from above. So, the more we look at the various sophists, the more the few who do argue that morality doesn't matter seem like they're going to be outliers. So, where does this idea come from? Well, it probably stems from the fact that many sophists decided to study both religion and morality as natural human phenomena, and tried to give naturalistic explanations for their existence. In other words, the sophists undertook very early versions of moral psychology and sociology, as well as the study of religious belief as a human phenomenon. I'll be drawing a lot from the chapter by Richard Brett for this, as well as the original sources themselves. In Plato's Dialogues, Protagoras gives an argument for how humanity came to have its laws and moral customs. He says he could either tell it in the form of a story or as a straightforward argument, and he goes with the fabular version for the sake of this dialogue. He says that when the gods were designing the animals, they were dispensing various offensive and defensive capabilities to the various creatures, like claws on eagles and teeth on crocodiles and so on and so forth. But they ran out of these by the time they got to humans. So eventually, Prometheus, or Thinks Ahead, as he's known in this tale, steals intelligence from Athena and Hephaestus and dispenses it to mankind. And this is later supplemented by Zeus, who gives them civic intelligence and a sense of right and wrong, so that humanity could learn to cooperate and form societies and live in harmony with one another. And that's a pretty good thing, because without that ability, they would be easy prey for the more viciously endowed wild animals of the world. An important bit of context here, and something we'll talk about further in this section, is that Protagoras is known to have been an agnostic. So the story isn't a straightforward thing he is arguing has actually happened. It is instead a fabular version of a straightforward naturalistic argument. Protagoras is arguing that humans developed morality and custom, or nomos to use the ancient Greek term which also encompassed laws, so that they could cooperate with one another. Thus, on Protagoras' telling, morality and law and ethics are the result of humanity encountering a practical problem and then learning to overcome it. This view of nomos as separate from nature and often as human-made particularly worried Aristophanes, who paints the sophists, and Socrates incidentally, as dangerous to the social fabric of Athens, because he is worried that if we began to explain these things naturalistically, then they would sort of lose their bite, they would cease to be motivating for us. Richard Brett argues that this was almost certainly part of Plato's worry, that if people began to accept these explanations, then they would cease to be compelled by the nomos, and would instead fall into blatant immorality. As a side note here, Protagoras doesn't actually use the term nomos in this speech, but his argument is clearly related to this debate, and it is a theme in wider sophist literature. It's difficult to know how well-founded the concerns of people like Aristophanes and Plato were, considering the dearth of sources from around this time period. But today, the project of describing how morality came to be psychologically or socially or evolutionarily is a perfectly legitimate area of academic study. It's also worth noting here that you can accept a particular story of how morality came to be how it is and still be a moral realist, that is, still believe in stance-independent moral truths? These two questions can be treated separately. Likewise, the Sophists also attempted to explain religious belief as a natural phenomenon. We've already seen that Protagoras himself was an agnostic, believing that even if there were a god, our human viewpoint would be far too limited to grasp him or know him in any depth. And other Sophists actively posited theories about how religious belief came to be among people. For this next bit, I'll be drawing a lot from the chapter by Miriam Cotwick. The most well-known sophist to opine on why we currently believe in gods was Prodicus. To quote Cotwick's essay directly, "The main point of Prodicus's theory seems to be that traditional gods, such as Demeter and Dionysus, are personified projections of human feelings of awe and gratitude toward elements that are beneficial in their lives. Prodicus's views on the gods thus involve a psychological analysis of human behavior and an understanding of religious beliefs as the result of historical and technological change that can be tracked, at least in its main stages. So for Prodicus, the particular gods of the Greek pantheon were beings gradually abstracted from the things that they were the gods of, and then human praise was redirected from the things themselves to the gods who represented them." Cotwick also cites a piece of evidence known as the Sisyphus fragment. The authorship of this passage is in some dispute, but it's thought to either be written by Critias, who is a borderline sophist, or it's from a play by Euripides that is parroting the view of some contemporary sophist. It is called the Sisyphus fragment because the character who is speaking it is probably Sisyphus of Imagine Him Happy fame. In this fragment, Sisyphus explains that the idea of gods were created in order that humans continued to behave morally and appropriately even when there was no other person there to keep an eye on them. It's what bridged the public-private divide in matters of ethics and ensured there was no time where someone could think something like, well, if I act badly now, then it could never come back to bite me. In both cases, these are not outright declarations of atheism. It could be that, like Protagoras, these sophists were agnostic, or it could be that they did believe in God, but in a more abstract God, like many of the pre-Socratics did. However, much like the case of morality, some contemporary Athenians, like Aristophanes, seem to view this kind of thinking as dangerous. It's also worth noting here that sometimes the sophists are referred to in extant literature as atheists, but we've got to bear in mind the usage of the term here. In ancient Greece, calling someone an atheist is a bit like calling them impious or amoral. It's not necessarily a reflection on their actual beliefs. There's just been a great change in how the word is used here. These two attempts to naturalistically explain a set of metaphysical beliefs reflects a kind of general theme in some of the sophists, most notably Protagoras, but also in some others as well. And that theme places less emphasis on direct metaphysical arguing and more on what we would now deem as psychological and sociological inquiry. This was anathema to Plato, who was himself a great metaphysician. But we don't need to take such a dim view on this project. In many ways, this commits the sophists to a nascent form of empiricism, though not empiricism in the way that we would understand the term today. Again, this doesn't apply universally. There is evidence from Aristotle that the sophist engaged in metaphysics, and there are some surviving texts from the sophist Gorgias which seem very metaphysical in nature, though some have interpreted them as a parody of earlier metaphysical writing instead, probably by Parmenides and the Eleatics. But to kind of zoom out and look at a general trend, the sophists do appear to stick to the world of observation far more so than Plato's Socrates. And in this, they are remarkably modern. At the very least, with the exception of Antiphon, the major sophists don't appear to have been particularly antisocial, nor to have actively promoted antisocial behavior, even though they were sometimes perceived in this way. Both Protagoras and Prodicus have narratives that explicitly praise virtue, and civic virtue in particular, as far better than succumbing to vice or antisociality. Now, I'm sure there were some sophists who were genuine egoists and maybe even outright bastards, but it seems they must have been few and far between, and there are going to be people like that in any intellectual movement. Moreover, the idea that the sophists cared about personal success more than they cared about virtue may simply reflect a pretty important fact about their general context. The Greek word for virtue, arete, underwent a major change in meaning over the course of the 2 centuries after the Sophists lived. By the time we see writings by major Greek Stoics, the word means moral virtue roughly as we understand it today. That is, as a character trait that is broadly separate from things like your circumstances or your reputation. But this was not how the term was used in the 5th century BC. Then, the term meant sort of the good life in a more all-encompassing sense that included the way that your fellow citizens thought of you and your general societal standing, as well as your personal qualities and what we would now call your moral qualities. Thus, when the Sophists praise reputation and social success, they're not simply being mercenary. It reflects a more general trend in the way that virtue was seen at the time, which had not yet separated someone's standing in civic society from their personal character traits, at least not totally. We might disagree with the Sophists here, but it's just a bit unfair of them to anticipate 2 centuries of philosophical development all by themselves. Thus, especially regarding the more famous Sophists, the charge that they were corrupting the youth is probably overblown. We already know from the trial of Socrates that it's possible for people to ascribe this charge rather widely, and there is little evidence that the Sophists promoted antisocial behavior in the way that they are sometimes supposed to have done. But next, I want to move on to what I think is the most interesting Sophist idea, and one reason why I think it is worth continuing to read and learn about the Sophists today. 4. Man is the measure of all things. Possibly the most controversial quote from any Sophist is Protagoras' line, "Man is the measure of all things, of what is, that it is, and of what is not, that it is not." As we saw, this is sometimes used to argue that the Sophists didn't believe in truth, but were kind of a real-life version of the straw man idea of a postmodernist who thinks that we all have our own individual truths and there is literally no better opinion than any other opinion, and there's no arbitrating between opinions at all. This interpretation normally draws on a section from Plato's Euthydemus, where Socrates says the following. This thesis of yours, which is maintained and employed by the disciples of Protagoras and others before them, and which to me appears to be quite wonderful as well as destructive, and I think that I'm most likely to hear the truth about it from you. The dictum is, there is no such thing as falsehood. A man must either say what is true or say nothing. This is how the ancient historian Diogenes Laertius argues that Protagoras thought contradiction between people was impossible, since when we speak, we are all simply saying our own subjective truths. However, I think there's good reason to be pretty skeptical of this interpretation. The first is that the Euthydemus is a comic dialogue aimed at lampooning 2 possibly fictional sophists, so I think we should be careful about its precise historical accuracy. The second is that even within this quote, this idea is attributed to some disciples of Protagoras and not Protagoras himself. And the third is that when we do see Protagoras appear in Plato's dialogues, he seems to argue that some ideas are straightforwardly true and others are straightforwardly false. When he and Socrates are arguing over whether virtue can be taught, Protagoras doesn't say things like, "Oh, well, you're entitled to your truth and I have mine and there's no arguing between us." He has a perfectly straightforward argument for his position, and neither he nor any of the other very prominent sophists present bring up this strange ultra-subjectivism. Given this, I think we should interpret the phrase, "man is the measure of all things," a bit more charitably, and this can be done in a number of ways. Richard McKirahan thinks that maybe this phrase is taken from one of Protagoras' books on legal argumentation, and thus is simply observing what occurs within the context of a law court, namely that the judgment itself arbitrates on what is true for the sake of legality, and this would place the maxim outside the realm of philosophy altogether. It would simply be illustrating a principle of law. It could also be referring to a doctrine of privileged access regarding the contents of our own sense perceptions. Protagoras may just be saying something like, we all have access to our own sense data and can't be corrected where they are concerned. This is a far less controversial position, and although it still has its weaknesses, and in fact, I've critiqued it in the past, it is not as out there as arguing that everyone has their own private truths. It's just arguing that everyone has their own private perceptions. Plato attributes something like this idea to Protagoras in another one of his dialogues called the Theaetetus. According to him, Protagoras might say something like, "The wind feels warm to you and cold to me, but that doesn't mean that either of us is wrong in our own perception of the wind." Expanding this idea outwards, we might use other examples to illustrate this point, like if you viewed a cube from a misleading angle that made it look like a flat square, then you might misidentify the properties of the cube. You would see it as 2D rather than 3D. But you would still be right in saying that it looks like a flat square to you. This is a kind of relativism in that it makes each of our perceptions relative to us, but it's not the kind of relativism that makes talking about truth impossible, and I know it's a much more modest proposal is my point. Personally, I like to interpret the maxim as not saying each individual man is the measure of all things, but rather that man as a whole is the measure of all things. That is, because we are limited by our own human standpoint, we can only get at the kinds of truths accessible to humans. Our definition of truth, then, must be concerned merely with what humans have access to in the realm of phenomena, not with some kind of ideal realm as Plato would have it in the forms. This would make Protagoras prefigure the observations of some more modern philosophers like Hume and Nietzsche and the pragmatist tradition. We might put this argument another way. Imagine that there was a world beyond that of perception and beyond our mere human limitations. Well, whatever it is, we can never talk about it, or know about it, or decide what is true about it. Thus, when we call things true or false, we can only be using criteria that were formed within the limits of human thought and perception. There might be a kind of vague sense in which there could be truths that lie beyond humanity, but they must be of a very different sort to the ones that we normally talk about and how we normally use the words. And they're kind of idle anyway, since by definition we could never come into contact with them. Thus, since we never encounter this theoretical posit of the world in itself, and only ever encounter the world as framed through the human standpoint, man is then the measure of all things. This doesn't imply that there is no truth, but rather the kind of truths that humans talk about and care about must be human-framed. I've given a compressed version of this argument here, but if you want it in a bit more detail, you can find it in the last section of my Introduction to the Philosophy of Science, right here, whichever corner it is. Now, I'm willing to admit that there is probably some of my own bias and projection coming in here. I like this kind of thinking, and so I am prone to interpreting what I read as in some way related to it. However, we do know that Protagoras was concerned with the limits of human knowledge, because that was the foundation of his agnosticism. We also know that Protagoras had empiricist leanings, and that he placed a high emphasis on how people perceived the world, such that Plato sometimes has him arguing that each person's perceptions are privileged for them. Even one of Protagoras' more embarrassing moments, which is arguing against simple geometric truths, came about because he didn't believe that objects like perfect circles and perfect lines existed, since we never observed them. So, interpreting all of this charitably, Protagoras may have thought that when we talk about truth, we can only mean stable truth in the world of appearances. That is, truth about predicting phenomena, rather than correspondence to an ideal realm, as in Plato. You'll notice that this looks extremely similar to how many of us would describe scientific truth, that its job is to predict future observations, and that it is true to the extent that those observations continue to hold. And perhaps this is a bit of a long shot as far as interpretive fidelity is concerned. It's difficult to know because we have so few of Protagoras' own words. We tend to only have him filtered through other people. But I do think that it indicates the advantage inherent in at least trying to interpret some of these thinkers more charitably than people have done so traditionally. At the absolute worst, we'll end up stumbling across some highly interesting philosophical ideas where they were not initially intended. And at best, we will be actively recapturing some genuine philosophical innovations from over 2,000 years ago. And considering how prescient and surprisingly empirical many of the sophists were in other areas, I don't think this is completely far-fetched. So, putting together all of these aspects of the defense of the sophists, we can find a more generous way of viewing their work. It is true that many of them were teachers of rhetoric, and some, like Gorgias, saw this as their primary profession. But at the same time, we see as a general trend a mixture of moderate empiricism, respectable skepticism, and early attempts at sociology and psychology. Now, you might think that these are philosophically mistaken positions or misguided pursuits, and that is absolutely fine. However, even if all of that is true, I think this still squarely qualifies the sophists as philosophers, and they don't deserve to be exiled into another category and slandered as pseudo-thinkers for the rest of time. I simply don't think the evidence points in that direction. But I think it's worth stepping back and reflecting what we can learn from this whole exercise. And this next bit's going to be mostly anecdotal, so, bear that in mind. 5. What to do about the Sophists? The first obvious lesson I think we can take from this general exercise is to be a little bit careful of the received histories that we get of philosophers and their impact. It's not that there's nothing in them, they're often quite insightful, but at the same time, they will have to be somewhat simplified and leave out important details. This even happens with received narratives of ancient philosophy that are basically true in their broad strokes. For example, I've said in the past, and I still maintain it is broadly accurate to say, that Stoicism in the abstract consists of 3 strands. It's physics, it's logic, and it's ethics. If I had to explain what Stoicism is to someone without reference to the idiosyncrasies of any particular thinker, I would make reference to all 3 of these parts and explain how they interrelate. However, if we were to, zoom in and look at individual Stoics in detail, we see that even though this is broadly accurate, its limitations are also definitely there. It doesn't, for example, take into account the shift towards ethics and away from physics that occurred in the period known as Imperial Stoicism. That is, the Stoicism that we associate with thinkers around during the Roman Empire. This is also where we see Stoic logic take on very different emphases. In earlier Stoicism, like that of Chrysippus, the formal component to Stoic logic is examined in quite a lot of detail, whereas in someone like Epictetus, Stoic logic is largely referenced in its more philosophical, epistemological dimensions. So even though all of these thinkers identified as Stoics, and we can identify these broad trends between them, they also differed in numerous ways. And the situation is even starker with a group like the Sophists, where they didn't share a self-owned identity, and instead the label was applied to them much later down the line, specifically by their critics. In this video, I've tried to defend some prominent Sophists, but it is impossible to defend sophism or sophistry as a definite philosophy, because no such philosophy exists. There's just this loose collection of thinkers who span about 100 years of Greek thought, and who agreed on some things and disagreed on others. We've even seen some of that disagreement here in the different stories given about justice and custom. So, the first lesson I took from my study of these thinkers is to be skeptical of what you are told about particular philosophers or trains of philosophical thought if you haven't gone and investigated them yourself. It's not that such received historical narratives are nonsense or anything like that. Even in the case of the Sophists, we've seen that some of the charges against them were justified in some cases. But they are almost certainly simplified, and you will get a more nuanced idea of what these thinkers thought by going back to the original sources, so far as they exist, and by looking at the specialist secondary literature on the topic. This sounds really obvious, but I bet there are loads of these kinds of neat stories that I and many others have just imbibed about certain thinkers without ever thinking to stop and question them. Sometimes the way we describe thinkers would be unrecognizable to the thinkers themselves, even down to the terms we use and the way we categorize them. And I think that's worth bearing in mind when we engage with their ideas. Secondly, certain sophists, like Protagoras and Prodicus, have ideas that are well worth our consideration, at least as much as someone like Plato. Although there are difficulties inherent to this, in that much more of Plato's work survives, if we are going to look at ancient philosophy for inspiration and learning, there is no good reason to completely overlook the Sophists. In some ways, such as their examination of religion as a sociological phenomenon as well as a theological one, they are really quite ahead of the curve, and we wouldn't see the resurgence of these ideas for quite some time. And although the particular explanations they give differ from the ones we would give today, the very fact that they are embarking on this project is incredibly historically precocious, if that's a correct phrase to use. Thirdly, and this has been a kind of unspoken undercurrent to the video, there is far less difference in approach between the Sophists and Socrates than we might have initially considered. We've already seen that they were viewed as quite similar in the eye of many Athenians, so much so that Aristophanes lumped them together as one group. The historian Diogenes Laertius even credits Protagoras as originating the kind of critical questioning that would later become known as Socratic. So the neat division we have of the Sophists on one side as dishonest bastards and Socrates on the other as the kind of angelic seeker of pure truth is not nearly as hard and fast as it's often presented. And finally, and this kind of links back to what I was saying earlier, I want to encourage us not to write philosophers off based on their reputation or because you've heard some bad things about them. When I first decided to go and research this topic, there was a big part of me that thought it might end up being a total waste of time. I'd always kind of gently assumed that the rumors were true, and the Sophists had no real philosophical or historical value except to be proven wrong by Socrates. When they were interpreted more charitably, like, say, by Nietzsche, I kind of thought that this was insight being extracted from them rather than insight being in them. But I was just wrong. And this got me thinking about how many other philosophical reputations put people off studying particular thinkers. You might have heard that Hegel is far too obscure, or that Nietzsche is hopelessly inconsistent, or that 20th century analytic philosophy is too technical and is only worried about pointless tautologies anyway. I would be a bit skeptical about all of these claims, though I do still find Hegel very difficult, which is why I don't talk about him too much on the channel. And yet, I have heard people use these as reasons to not engage with these thinkers. We all have a limited number of hours in the day, and so a limited number of people that we can read and consider and study. But I do hope that if this video has demonstrated just one thing, it's that sometimes the preemptive criticisms and rumors are not entirely true, and that it's sometimes worth ignoring this general well poisoning and checking them out for yourself. And if you'd like to do that for the Sophists, I've linked some excellent sources that I found very helpful below. But if you want to look at a video about how some modern readers might misinterpret another school of thought, the Stoics, I have a video on that right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.